When terrorists think they've found the perfect target, a commercial airliner filled with defenseless passengers and crew, they never imagined that the quiet flight attendant serving coffee in the back galley once flew fighter jets through enemy fire. They never considered that behind her polite smile and professional uniform lies years of combat training, classified missions, and a kill count that would make hardened soldiers pause. What happens when hijackers pick the wrong plane, threaten the wrong passengers, and underestimate the wrong woman? What unfolds when a decorated combat pilot, disguised as ordinary cabin crew, must choose between maintaining her cover and protecting 300 innocent lives at 30,000 feet? This is the true story of Captain Sarah Mitchell, a woman whose past was buried in classified files, whose present was serving peanuts and checking seatbelts, and whose future would be decided in the most terrifying 90 minutes of commercial aviation history. The hijackers thought they held all the cards. They had weapons, training, and a carefully planned operation. But they made one fatal mistake. They assumed they knew who they were dealing with. Sometimes the most dangerous person on a plane isn't the one making threats. Sometimes it's the one serving drinks with a smile, carrying secrets that could change everything, waiting for the moment when her two worlds collide in the most unexpected way possible. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her navy blue uniform blazer as she walked through the employee entrance at Denver International Airport. The early morning light cast long shadows across the tarmac, and she could see their aircraft, a Boeing 777 bound for London, being prepped by the ground crew. To everyone around her, she was just another flight attendant starting another routine international shift. Nobody knew that 5 years ago, she had been Captain Sarah Mitchell of the United States Air Force, flying F-16 Fighting Falcons over hostile territory in the Middle East. The transformation hadn't been easy. Going from commanding a multi-million-dollar fighter jet to serving beverages at 30,000 feet required more than just a career change. It demanded a complete reinvention of identity. Sarah had made this choice deliberately, seeking normalcy after years of classified missions and life-or-death decisions that haunted her dreams. The airline industry offered structure, routine, and most importantly, anonymity. Here, she could be ordinary. As she entered the crew briefing room, Sarah nodded to her colleagues with the practiced smile she had perfected over 3 years with Continental Airways. Captain Robert Hayes, the flight's commanding officer, was reviewing weather reports with First Officer Jennifer Park. Hayes was a veteran pilot with 22 years of experience, known for his calm demeanor and impeccable safety record. Park, younger and more energetic, had joined the airline straight from the Navy, though her military background was limited to transport aircraft. "Morning, Sarah," Hayes said, without looking up from his charts. "We've got a full load today, 312 passengers. Weather looks good, though we might hit some turbulence over the Atlantic. Nothing we can't handle." Sarah poured herself coffee from the crew station, her movements efficient and practiced. "Any special requests or concerns for the cabin today?" she asked, settling into her role as senior flight attendant. Her team consisted of 7 other cabin crew members, most of whom she had worked with before. They were good people, professional, caring, and completely unaware that their colleague had once engaged enemy aircraft in aerial combat. The briefing covered standard procedures, meal service times, turbulence protocols, and passenger manifest highlights. They had several unaccompanied minors on board, a few passengers with mobility issues, and a group of college students heading to London for a study abroad program. Normal challenges for a normal flight. What the crew didn't know was that among the passenger manifest were 4 names that had appeared on several international watch lists over the past 18 months. Ahmed Nazir, traveling on a Pakistani passport, had been flagged by intelligence agencies for suspicious travel patterns. His seat was in 14A. Marcus Weber, holding German documentation, had been photographed at several locations where terrorist cells were later discovered. He was assigned to 22C. The other 2, traveling under different identities, had boarded using passports that intelligence analysts would later discover were expertly forged. These 4 men had spent months planning this operation. They had studied flight patterns, security protocols, and crew procedures. They knew that commercial aircraft were vulnerable during the long hours over the Atlantic, far from any possibility of emergency landing. They understood that passengers and crew would be tired, less alert after several hours of routine flight. They had weapons, carefully constructed to avoid detection. Pieces that could be assembled into functional firearms once airborne. But in all their planning, they had made one critical oversight. They had researched the flight crew's backgrounds, but their intelligence was limited to official airline records. Captain Hayes' military service was noted. He had flown transport planes in the Air Force before transitioning to commercial aviation. First Officer Park's Navy background was documented, but Sarah Mitchell's file showed only her civilian career. 3 years with Continental Airways, excellent performance reviews, no disciplinary actions. The military records that would have revealed her true background were classified at levels the terrorists couldn't access. They had no way of knowing that she had completed over 200 combat missions, that she had engaged enemy aircraft in dogfights over hostile territory, or that she had earned commendations for valor under fire. Her transition to civilian life had been handled through special programs designed to protect the identities of pilots who had participated in classified operations. As the crew completed their pre-flight preparations, Sarah performed her routine checks at the cabin. She walked through the aisles, ensuring safety equipment was properly stowed, checking that seatbelts and tray tables were secured. Her trained eye automatically assessed the passengers as they boarded, a habit from her military days that she had never quite shaken. She noted the nervous businessman in ATF who kept checking his phone, the elderly couple in 15D who were obviously first-time international travelers, the group of teenagers excited about their London adventure. She also noticed things her civilian colleagues missed, the way Ahmed Nazir avoided eye contact when she greeted him, how Marcus Weber seemed overly familiar with aircraft layout for someone who claimed to be a casual traveler. Small details that meant nothing in isolation but formed patterns recognizable to someone with combat training. The flight departed Denver at 7:45 a.m. Mountain Time, exactly on schedule. The takeoff was smooth, and within minutes they were climbing toward their cruising altitude of 39,000 feet. Sarah began her routine service preparations, coordinating with the galley staff and reviewing passenger special meal requests. Everything proceeded normally for the first 2 hours of what was scheduled to be an 8-hour flight. Passengers settled into their routines, some reading, others watching movies on the in-flight entertainment system, many simply sleeping. The college students were excited and chatty, discussing their plans for London. Business travelers worked on laptops or caught up on rest. Sarah and her crew moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, serving beverages and ensuring passenger comfort. It was during the meal service, approximately 3 hours into the flight, when Sarah first noticed the subtle signs that something was wrong. She was serving meals in the economy section when she observed Marcus Weber getting up from his seat and walking toward the forward lavatories. Nothing unusual about that, except she had seen him make the same trip twice in the past 30 minutes. More concerning was the brief eye contact he made with Ahmed Nazir as he passed row 14. Sarah continued her service duties, but her awareness heightened. She began paying closer attention to the 4 passengers she had unconsciously flagged during boarding. Over the next 20 minutes, she observed a pattern of movement that was almost certainly coordinated. Each man visited the lavatory in sequence, staying longer than typical, and returning to their seats with subtle changes in posture or behavior. Her military training kicked in without conscious thought. She began mapping the aircraft layout in tactical terms: exit points, potential weapons, defensive positions. She noted which passengers might be assets in a crisis situation and which might become liabilities. She identified crew members' locations and capabilities. All of this happened beneath the surface of her continued professional demeanor, serving meals and chatting pleasantly with passengers. When Ahmed Nazir stood up again and began walking toward the forward galley area, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing her meal service, she quietly moved to intercept him, maintaining her friendly flight attendant persona while positioning herself strategically. "Can I help you with something?" she asked politely, as Nazir approached the galley area where Captain Hayes had just emerged from the cockpit to use the facilities. Nazir's response was not verbal. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and produced what appeared to be a weapon, a small but functional firearm that had been assembled from components carried separately by the 4 conspirators. In the same instant, Sarah heard commotion from other parts of the cabin as his accomplices revealed themselves simultaneously. "Nobody move!" Nazir shouted, his voice carrying throughout the cabin. "This aircraft is now under our control." The transformation in the cabin was immediate and terrifying. Passengers screamed, some diving for cover behind seats, others freezing in place. Children began crying. The careful normalcy of commercial flight shattered in seconds. But Sarah Mitchell didn't scream. She didn't freeze. Instead, something else entirely happened. Something the hijackers could never have anticipated. The mild-mannered flight attendant who had been serving coffee and meals disappeared, replaced instantly by the combat pilot who had faced enemy fire over hostile territory. Her assessment of the situation was instantaneous and tactical. 4 hostiles, armed with improvised weapons, approximately 300 civilian assets requiring protection, limited space for maneuvering, no backup, no escape routes, no option except decisive action. The hijackers had planned for panic, confusion, and submission. They had studied passenger behavior in crisis situations and crew responses to threats. They were prepared for heroes among the passengers, strong men who might try to overpower them, or crew members who might attempt to alert ground control. They were not prepared for a decorated combat pilot with multiple confirmed aerial victories who had trained extensively in close-quarters combat and crisis management under pressure. They were not prepared for someone who had made split-second life-or-death decisions in environments far more dangerous than a commercial aircraft cabin. As chaos erupted around her, Sarah Mitchell made the choice that would define the next hour and a half. She could maintain her cover, hope the situation would resolve itself, and protect her carefully constructed civilian identity. Or she could reveal who she really was, and use every skill she had learned in years of military service to protect the innocent people whose lives now hung in the balance. The quiet flight attendant who had served breakfast that morning was about to become something else entirely, something the terrorists had never imagined could exist at 39,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean. The real question wasn't whether she could handle the situation. The question was whether she could do so without revealing the classified background that had brought her to this moment. Captain Sarah Mitchell, callsign Viper, was about to come out of retirement in the most unexpected way possible. The moment Ahmed Nazir raised his weapon, time seemed to slow for Sarah Mitchell. Her mind automatically shifted into combat mode, assessing threats and calculating responses with the precision that had kept her alive through dozens of aerial engagements. The screaming passengers, the chaos in the aisles, the shouts from the other hijackers, all of it became background noise as her training took control. She had perhaps 2 seconds before Nazir would expect her to react like a typical flight attendant, with fear, confusion, or attempts to comply with his demands. Instead, Sarah used those precious moments to map the immediate tactical situation. Did she guard? Captain Hayes was emerging from the lavatory, completely exposed. First Officer Park was still in the cockpit, unaware of the crisis unfolding in the cabin. The other 3 hijackers were revealing themselves simultaneously throughout the aircraft. What happened next would later be described differently by various witnesses, but most agreed on the essential facts. The flight attendant moved with impossible speed and precision, disarming the lead hijacker before he could fully comprehend what was occurring. Sarah's movement was fluid and decisive. She stepped forward as if to comply with Nazir's commands, bringing herself within arm's reach. Then, using techniques learned in years of military close combat training, she struck with calculated force. Her left hand diverted the weapon, while her right delivered a precise blow to Nazir's throat, temporarily incapacitating him. The gun clattered across the galley floor as Nazir stumbled backward, gasping for air. The passengers in the forward section witnessed this transformation with shock and confusion. The polite woman who had been serving their meals moments earlier had just neutralized an armed terrorist with movements that belonged in an action movie, not a commercial aircraft cabin. "Stay down!" Sarah commanded the passengers in a voice that carried absolute authority, not the pleasant, service-oriented tone they had heard all morning, but something harder, more commanding. Some passengers later said it reminded them of military officers they had known. But the situation was far from resolved. The other 3 hijackers had positioned themselves strategically throughout the cabin. Marcus Weber had taken control of the midsection, herding passengers away from the emergency exits. The 3rd hijacker, operating under the name Hassan Khalil, had moved to the rear of the aircraft, ensuring no one could approach from behind. The 4th, who would later be identified as Dmitry Petrov despite his forged passport, was advancing toward the cockpit. Sarah's mind raced through possible scenarios. Her immediate success against Nazir had bought her seconds, not minutes. The other hijackers would adapt quickly, and her cover as an ordinary crew member was now completely blown. The passengers were looking at her with confusion and hope, expecting her to somehow resolve a situation that should have been far beyond her capabilities. Captain Hayes, still processing what he had witnessed, began moving toward the cockpit to alert ground control and follow standard hijacking protocols. But Dmitry Petrov intercepted him, pressing what appeared to be an improvised knife to the pilot's throat. "Everyone stop!" Petrov shouted in accented English. "The pilot dies if anyone moves." This was the moment that would define everything that followed. Sarah faced a choice that went beyond tactical considerations. She could attempt to maintain some pretense of being an ordinary flight attendant who had simply gotten lucky, or she could fully embrace the skills and training that were clearly needed to save lives. The decision was made for her when she heard First Officer Park's voice over the cabin intercom. attempting to follow standard protocol by informing the hijackers that the aircraft could be landed at the nearest airport if they stated their demands. Park's training was excellent for normal emergencies, but she was thinking like a civilian pilot, not someone who understood asymmetric warfare. "Turn off that radio," Weber shouted from the midsection. No contact with ground. Sarah realized that the hijackers' plan was more sophisticated than a simple demand for landing rights or prisoner releases. They wanted to prevent any communication with authorities, which suggested their ultimate goal involved using the aircraft itself as a weapon, a scenario that had become terrifyingly familiar in recent years. The mathematics of the situation was stark. 4 armed individuals had control of an aircraft with over 300 people aboard, flying over the Atlantic Ocean with no possibility of emergency landing for several hours. Standard negotiation protocols would not apply. Military response was impossible at their current location. The only assets available were what existed within the aircraft itself. Sarah made her choice. Moving with the same decisive precision she had used against Nazir, she began coordinating a response that drew on every aspect of her military training. But she also understood that her effectiveness would depend on convincing both the passengers and crew to follow someone they thought was just a flight attendant. "Listen to me carefully," she said to Captain Hayes, her voice low but carrying clearly. "I need you to trust me completely and do exactly what I say. Do not ask questions, do not hesitate, and do not deviate from my instructions." Hayes looked at her with confusion, but something in her tone, the absolute confidence, the tactical precision of her words, made him nod in agreement. "When I give the signal," Sarah continued, "you need to get to the cockpit and lock that door. Change the transponder code to 7500 and begin descent toward the nearest possible landing site. Don't worry about following their demands. Just get us down." "But they said," Hayes began.
"Captain," Sarah interrupted, and her tone carried an authority that made him pause. "In my previous career, I've dealt with situations like this before."
"Trust me." What Hayes couldn't know was that Sarah's previous career included extensive training in anti-terrorism operations, hostage rescue scenarios, and crisis management under extreme conditions. Her squadron had cross-trained with special operations units specifically for situations where military assets needed to operate in civilian environments. The challenge now was applying those skills to a commercial aircraft without causing panic among passengers or revealing information that remained classified even in this crisis. Sarah needed to neutralize the remaining 3 hijackers while protecting over 300 civilians in a confined space 39,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean. She began by assessing available resources. The cabin crew included several individuals with relevant backgrounds: Park's military experience, 2 flight attendants who had mentioned law enforcement training during crew briefings, and several passengers whose behavior and bearing suggested military or security backgrounds. Moving through the cabin with practiced casualness, Sarah began making contact with potential assets. She approached Dr. James Morrison, a passenger in C-12B whom she had noticed earlier due to his alertness and physical bearing. "Dr. Morrison," she said quietly, "I need to ask you a direct question. Do you have any military or law enforcement background?" Morrison looked at her with surprise, then glanced toward the hijackers who were maintaining control through intimidation and threats. "Army Special Forces," he said quietly. "Retired 2 years ago. Why?" "Because," Sarah said, "these men are planning to use this aircraft as a weapon, and we're the only thing standing between them and success. Are you willing to help?" Morrison's assessment of her was instant and accurate. The way she carried herself, the precision of her questions, the tactical awareness in her positioning. This was not a civilian flight attendant asking for passenger assistance. This was someone with serious military training coordinating a counter-operation. "What do you need?" he asked simply. Sarah began laying out a plan that drew on her extensive experience in crisis management and combat operations. The approach would be coordinated, simultaneous, and designed to minimize civilian casualties while neutralizing all 4 threats. But it would require precise timing, careful communication, and willingness from crew and passengers to take significant risks. As she moved through the cabin, identifying assets and communicating instructions, Sarah was simultaneously calculating the aerodynamics and logistics of her plan. She needed to account for aircraft systems, emergency procedures, and the reality that any mistake at their current altitude and speed could result in catastrophic consequences for everyone aboard. The hijackers, meanwhile, were beginning to implement their own plan. Weber was collecting electronic devices from passengers, preventing any communication with ground authorities. Khalil was ensuring that no one in the rear section could organize resistance. Petrov maintained control over Captain Hayes while issuing demands that became increasingly clear in their ultimate intention. "This aircraft will not be landed at any airport," Petrov announced to the cabin. "We have a different destination in mind. Anyone who interferes will be killed, along with everyone around them." Sarah recognized the psychology of the threat, designed to prevent heroic action by making passengers fear that resistance would endanger others. It was an effective technique against civilians, but she had seen similar tactics in military operations and knew how to counter them. The key was creating a scenario where the hijackers lost control simultaneously across multiple points, preventing them from carrying out retaliatory actions against passengers. This required coordination that would challenge even experienced military units, and she was working with civilians who had no tactical training. But Sarah had advantages the hijackers couldn't anticipate. Her understanding of aircraft systems was far superior to their basic knowledge. Her experience in three-dimensional tactical thinking, essential for aerial combat, gave her insights into movement and positioning within the aircraft that ground-based terrorists couldn't match. Most importantly, she had trained extensively for scenarios where conventional rules of engagement didn't apply. As she finalized her preparations, Sarah looked around the cabin at the faces of people depending on her for survival. Children clutching their parents, elderly passengers confused and frightened, young adults who had been excited about their London adventure just hours earlier. The weight of responsibility was enormous, but it was familiar. She had carried similar weight in combat situations where split-second decisions determined who lived or died. The difference was that in aerial combat, she had been alone in her aircraft, responsible primarily for her own survival and mission success. Now she was responsible for over 300 lives, working with civilian assets, operating within the constraints of international airspace and commercial aviation regulations. But the core skills remained the same: assess, plan, execute, adapt. The hijackers thought they had planned for every contingency. They were about to discover that they had never planned for Captain Sarah Mitchell, call sign Viper, emerging from 3 years of carefully maintained cover to protect innocent lives using skills learned in some of the most dangerous airspace in the world. The quiet flight attendant was gone. In her place stood a combat veteran who had faced enemy fire and survived, who had made life-or-death decisions under pressure, and who was about to demonstrate that sometimes the most dangerous person on an aircraft is the one nobody suspects. Sarah's plan required precise coordination across multiple sections of the aircraft, executed simultaneously to prevent the hijackers from retaliating against passengers. She had identified 5 key assets among the crew and passengers. Dr. Morrison, with his Special Forces background, Flight Attendant Maria Santos, who had mentioned police training, a passenger named David Chen, who carried himself like military personnel, First Officer Park in the cockpit, and surprisingly, elderly passenger Robert Thompson in seat 18A, whose calm demeanor and tactical awareness suggested significant experience despite his age. The challenge was communicating her plan without alerting the hijackers, who were maintaining visual control over most of the cabin. Sarah used a combination of hand signals, whispered conversations during routine service movements, and coded language that sounded like normal crew coordination but carried tactical meaning to those with military backgrounds. Moving through the cabin with a beverage cart, she made contact with each asset. "Mr. Thompson," she said quietly as she served him coffee, "your service record shows interesting travel patterns." It was a probe, designed to confirm her assessment of his background. Thompson looked at her with sharp eyes that had seen far more than his grandfatherly appearance suggested. 30 years, various theaters," he replied softly. "Retired as colonel. Rangers and Special Operations Command." Sarah felt a surge of relief. A career Special Operations veteran would understand complex tactical coordination without extensive briefing. "We have 4 hostile assets positioned at strategic points," she continued in the same conversational tone. "Simultaneous neutralization required to prevent civilian casualties." Thompson nodded almost imperceptibly. "Assets and timing. Signal will be cabin lighting cycle. 3 quick dims followed by emergency lighting activation. Forward section, my responsibility. Midsection, Morrison. Rear, Santos with Chen as backup. You coordinate passenger protection and emergency response." The exchange took less than 30 seconds and appeared to casual observation as normal passenger service. But Thompson immediately understood the sophistication of the operation being planned. The woman serving his coffee was thinking and communicating like a trained military officer, not a civilian flight attendant who had gotten lucky with one disarmed hijacker. Sarah continued her coordination, using the beverage service to position assets and communicate timing. Each conversation appeared routine while establishing tactical assignments. Dr. Morrison would handle Marcus Weber in the midsection, using his Special Forces training to neutralize the threat without endangering nearby passengers. Santos and Chen would coordinate against Hassan Khalil in the rear section, with Santos using her police training and Chen providing backup support. The most dangerous element was Dmitry Petrov, who maintained control over Captain Hayes near the cockpit. Sarah would handle him directly, but the timing would be crucial. Petrov had to be neutralized before he could harm Hayes or prevent access to the cockpit controls. First Officer Park was the wild card. She was trained in standard hijacking protocols, which emphasized compliance and negotiation rather than resistance. Sarah needed Park to understand that conventional approaches wouldn't work in this situation, and that unconventional action was necessary to save lives. Using the intercom system during routine announcements, Sarah embedded coded messages that Park would understand based on her military aviation background. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some technical difficulties with our navigation systems. Flight crew, please prepare for manual override procedures on my signal. To passengers, it sounded like standard crew communication during a crisis. But Park, with her Navy training, recognized manual override procedures as terminology that didn't apply to commercial navigation systems. Combined with Sarah's tone and the tactical situation, Park understood that unconventional action was planned and she needed to be prepared. The next phase required creating conditions that would allow simultaneous action across the aircraft. Sarah had observed that the hijackers maintained control through constant visual surveillance of the cabin. Breaking that surveillance pattern would provide the seconds needed for coordinated response. She began by creating deliberate distractions. Moving through the cabin with apparent compliance to hijacker demands, she systematically positioned herself to block sightlines between the four terrorists. When Weber in the midsection looked toward the forward area, Sarah positioned the beverage cart to obstruct his view of Petrov. When Khalil scanned the cabin from his rear position, she coordinated with other crew members to create visual barriers. These movements appeared random to the hijackers, but were carefully calculated to create moments of tactical opportunity. Sarah was applying principles of three-dimensional warfare learned in aerial combat to the confined space of the aircraft cabin. Meanwhile, she continued gathering intelligence about the hijackers' capabilities and intentions. Their weapons were improvised but functional. Firearms assembled from components that had passed security screening individually but formed effective weapons when combined. Their coordination suggested extensive planning and training. Most concerning, their lack of interest in traditional hijacking demands indicated they intended to use the aircraft itself as a weapon. The timeline was critical. Sarah estimated they had perhaps 90 minutes before reaching European airspace, where military intercept protocols would create additional complications. If the hijackers intended to target a European city, they would begin descent preparation soon. Once descent began, options for resistance would become significantly more limited. Sarah made her final preparations, ensuring each asset understood their role and timing. The plan would begin when she activated the emergency lighting system, a signal that would be visible throughout the cabin but would appear to be a response to aircraft technical difficulties rather than a coordinated counter-operation. But as she moved toward the galley control panel, Dmitry Petrov made an announcement that changed the entire tactical situation. "In 30 minutes, we will begin descent toward our target," he said loudly enough for the entire cabin to hear. "This aircraft will not be landing at any airport. We will complete our mission, and many will join us in paradise." The words sent a chill through the cabin that had nothing to do with altitude. Passengers realized they were not dealing with traditional hijackers seeking money, prisoner releases, or safe passage. They were facing individuals prepared to die and take everyone aboard with them in a suicide attack. Sarah's assessment shifted immediately. 30 minutes provided enough time for her plan, but it also meant the hijackers would soon begin preparations that might make resistance impossible. Suicide attackers operated with different psychology than traditional criminals. They had no self-preservation instinct that could be exploited, and they might accelerate their timeline if they sensed organized resistance. The mathematics of the situation became stark. Over 300 lives depended on precise execution of a plan that required split-second timing and flawless coordination among individuals who had never worked together in tactical situations. Failure would result not just in continued captivity, but in mass casualties when the aircraft was used as a weapon. Sarah caught Dr. Morrison's eye and saw understanding there. He had reached the same tactical assessment. Immediate action was required, regardless of risk. They could no longer afford to wait for perfect conditions or optimal positioning. Moving to the emergency lighting controls, Sarah made final visual contact with each asset. Thompson nodded slightly from his position in row 18. Chen shifted in his seat, ready for action. Santos moved closer to the rear section under pretense of checking on passengers. Morrison positioned himself within striking distance of Webber. First Officer Park's voice came over the intercom with an announcement that confirmed her readiness. Flight crew, prepare for emergency descent procedures. All crew to emergency stations. To passengers, it sounded like a response to the hijackers' demands. But to the military-trained individuals scattered through the cabin, it was confirmation that Park understood the situation and was prepared to take control of the aircraft once the cockpit was secured. Sarah's hand moved toward the lighting controls. 3 years of careful civilian cover were about to be completely blown. Her quiet life as an ordinary flight attendant was about to end permanently. But over 300 innocent people would live to see London if her plan succeeded. The irony wasn't lost on her. After years of trying to escape her military past, she was about to use every skill learned in combat to protect the very kind of innocent civilians she had originally joined the Air Force to defend. As her finger reached the emergency lighting switch, Sarah found herself thinking of her call sign, Viper. In aerial combat, a Viper strike was swift, precise, and deadly, designed to eliminate threats before they could respond. The hijackers had planned for many contingencies, but they had never planned for a Viper hidden among the cabin crew. The aircraft cabin lights dimmed once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession. Emergency lighting activated throughout the cabin, bathing everything in red illumination that transformed the familiar environment into something that looked like a combat zone. In that moment, Captain Sarah Mitchell ceased to exist. In her place was Viper, combat pilot, tactical operator, and the last line of defense for 300 innocent lives, flying at 39,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean. The counter-operation had begun, and the hijackers were about to discover that they had made the most dangerous mistake possible. They had threatened the wrong passengers while underestimating the wrong crew member. The quiet flight attendant was gone forever. What remained was a warrior who had trained for exactly this kind of impossible situation, who had the skills needed to succeed, and who understood that failure was not an option when innocent lives hung in the balance. The emergency lights continued to flash, and throughout the cabin, trained operators began moving with lethal precision toward their assigned targets. The hijackers had seconds to realize their situation had changed completely, before discovering that sometimes the most dangerous person on an aircraft is the one nobody suspects until it's too late. The emergency lighting signal triggered coordinated action across the aircraft cabin with military precision. Sarah moved toward Dmitry Petrov with fluid efficiency, her 3 years of civilian cover disappearing as combat instincts took control. The hijacker holding Captain Hayes had positioned himself strategically near the cockpit door, but he had made the fatal error of assuming his hostage provided complete protection. Sarah's approach utilized techniques learned in close-quarters combat training that few civilians had ever witnessed. Moving low and fast, she used passenger seats as cover while closing distance. Petrov saw her coming but miscalculated her capabilities, expecting desperate heroics from a frightened flight attendant rather than tactical precision from a trained operator. When Sarah struck, it was with the accumulated skill of someone who had trained extensively for scenarios where hesitation meant death. Her first move disabled Petrov's weapon arm with a strike that temporarily paralyzed the nerve cluster controlling his grip. The improvised firearm clattered to the floor as Petrov reflexively released Captain Hayes, who immediately moved toward the cockpit as instructed. But Petrov was not finished. Recovering faster than Sarah had anticipated, he produced a secondary weapon, a blade that had been concealed separately from his firearm. The confined space of the aircraft aisle became a battleground as trained combatants engaged in close-quarters fighting that passengers watched with terror and disbelief. Sarah's aerial combat experience provided unexpected advantages in the 3-dimensional environment of the aircraft. Her understanding of spatial relationships, developed through years of high-speed maneuvering in fighter aircraft, translated into superior positioning within the cabin's confined space. She used seatbacks, overhead compartments, and even the curvature of the aircraft walls to gain tactical advantages that ground-based training hadn't prepared Petrov to counter. Meanwhile, throughout the cabin, the other assets were engaging their assigned targets with varying degrees of success. Dr. Morrison's Special Forces background proved decisive against Marcus Webber in the midsection. Webber had been focused on controlling passengers through intimidation, but he wasn't prepared for a highly trained operator attacking from an unexpected angle. Morrison's approach was textbook special operations. Swift, silent, and overwhelmingly effective. Webber found himself on the cabin floor within seconds, his weapon disabled and his ability to threaten passengers permanently ended. Morrison immediately began coordinating with nearby passengers to secure the improvised weapons and establish control over the midsection of the aircraft. In the rear section, flight attendant Maria Santos and passenger David Chen faced greater challenges with Hassan Khalil. Santos's police training provided tactical awareness, but Khalil proved to be more skilled in combat than the other hijackers. Chen's military background became crucial as he provided backup support, turning a difficult one-on-one confrontation into a coordinated two-person operation that gradually overwhelmed Khalil's defenses. The most unexpected contribution came from Colonel Robert Thompson, whose decades of special operations experience proved invaluable in coordinating passenger safety while the combat unfolded. Thompson moved through the cabin with practiced authority, directing passengers to protective positions and ensuring that children and elderly travelers were shielded from the violence. His calm competence in an impossible situation provided stability that prevented panic from escalating into chaos. Passengers later described his presence as somehow reassuring, a grandfatherly figure who seemed to understand exactly what was happening and how to keep people safe while others fought for their lives. But the situation remained dangerous. Ahmed Nazir, whom Sarah had initially disabled, had recovered enough to become a threat again. Still suffering from her initial strike to his throat, he moved through the forward cabin with desperate determination, seeking to salvage the operation by reaching the cockpit or taking hostages among the passengers. Sarah, still engaged with Petrov in close-quarters combat, could see Nazir's movement in her peripheral vision. The tactical situation was becoming complex, multiple threats, confined space, hundreds of civilians at risk. It required the kind of rapid decision-making and situational awareness that had kept her alive in aerial combat against multiple enemy aircraft. Drawing on every aspect of her training, Sarah made a calculated decision. Instead of prolonging her engagement with Petrov, she shifted tactics to end the confrontation quickly, accepting additional personal risk to prevent Nazir from threatening passengers. Her final moves against Petrov were executed with the precision of someone who understood that perfect technique was less important than decisive action. Using the aircraft's narrow aisle to her advantage, she trapped Petrov in a position where his blade couldn't be effectively used, while simultaneously delivering strikes that ended his ability to continue fighting. With Petrov neutralized, Sarah immediately turned toward Nazir, who had reached the area near the forward galley where several passengers were cowering in fear. His recovery from her initial attack had left him weakened but still dangerous, and his desperation made him unpredictable in ways that tactical training couldn't fully prepare for. The confrontation with Nazir became a test of everything Sarah had learned in combat operations. Unlike Petrov, who had fought with skill but conventional tactics, Nazir fought with the fervor of someone committed to completing his mission regardless of personal survival. His attacks were erratic but intense, forcing Sarah to adapt techniques designed for predictable military opponents to deal with an adversary operating beyond normal tactical parameters. The aircraft cabin became an arena where years of classified military training met fanatical determination in a contest that would decide the fate of everyone aboard. Passengers pressed against windows and huddled in seats watched events that seemed impossible. Their mild-mannered flight attendant engaged in life-or-death combat using skills that belonged in military operations, not commercial aviation. Sarah's final neutralization of Nazir required techniques she had hoped never to use again after leaving military service. But with over 300 lives at stake and no backup available, she applied exactly the level of force necessary to permanently end the threat he represented to innocent passengers. Meanwhile, Captain Hayes had reached the cockpit and was working with First Officer Park to regain control of the aircraft systems and communications. Park's naval aviation background proved crucial as she understood the tactical situation without requiring lengthy explanations. Together, they began implementing emergency protocols while establishing contact with ground authorities. The cockpit communications revealed the scope of what had been prevented. Air traffic control had been attempting to contact the flight for over 20 minutes, and military assets were being positioned for possible intercept operations. The hijackers' plan had involved using the aircraft to attack targets in London, and their timeline had been calculated to avoid military intervention. Sarah's counter-operation had succeeded, but the aftermath presented new challenges. The aircraft was now flying with 4 neutralized terrorists, a cabin full of traumatized passengers, and crew members who had witnessed their colleague transform from a service professional into a highly trained combat operator. The questions would begin soon, from passengers, crew, authorities, and intelligence agencies. Sarah's carefully maintained civilian cover was completely destroyed. Her classified military background would undergo scrutiny that could compromise ongoing operations and endanger other personnel who had transitioned to civilian careers. But as she looked around the cabin at the faces of people who were alive because of decisive action taken in an impossible situation, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving military service: the satisfaction of using her skills to protect innocent lives. Colonel Thompson approached her as she secured the improvised weapons and began coordinating with crew members to ensure passenger safety. His assessment was immediate and accurate. "Outstanding operation, Captain," he said quietly. "Textbook coordination under impossible conditions." Sarah looked at him with surprise. Her rank had never been revealed during the crisis. "Your tactical communication and operational planning," Thompson explained, "plus about a dozen other indicators that are obvious to someone with my background. You're not just military, you're a pilot. Combat pilot. Based on your spatial awareness and three-dimensional tactical thinking." Sarah nodded, accepting that her cover was permanently blown. "Captain Sarah Mitchell, call sign, Viper. Air Force Special Operations. Retired 3 years ago." "Colonel Robert Thompson, Army Special Operations Command. Retired 5 years ago," he replied. "And I have to say, Captain, that was some of the finest crisis management I've witnessed in 40 years of military service." As the aircraft continued toward London under Captain Hayes's control, Sarah began processing what had happened and what would come next. Her quiet civilian life was over. The skills she had tried to leave behind had saved lives, but using them had revealed her identity to hundreds of witnesses and multiple government agencies. The hijackers had failed in their mission, but they had succeeded in one unintended goal. They had forced Captain Sarah Mitchell, call sign Viper, to emerge from retirement in the most public way possible. The quiet flight attendant was gone forever. What remained was a decorated combat pilot who had just demonstrated that sometimes the most dangerous person on an aircraft is exactly the person innocent passengers need when their lives hang in the balance at 39,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean. The approach to London Heathrow took place under circumstances unlike any in commercial aviation history. Military escorts flanked the aircraft as Captain Hayes brought the Boeing 777 in for landing, while emergency response teams prepared for a situation that defied standard protocols. The aircraft carried over 300 passengers who had witnessed extraordinary events, 4 neutralized terrorists, and crew members whose understanding of their colleague had been permanently altered. Sarah spent the remaining flight time coordinating with authorities via encrypted communications that revealed her true background to officials who had been unaware of her presence on the aircraft. Air traffic control was rerouted to military frequencies as intelligence agencies tried to understand how a classified special operations pilot had ended up serving beverages on a commercial flight targeted by terrorists. The passengers remained in a state of shock and confusion. Many had recorded portions of the events on their phones before the terrorists destroyed electronic devices, creating documentation that would later become evidence in international terrorism prosecutions. But more than evidence, these recordings captured the transformation of someone they had known as a polite flight attendant into a highly trained operator whose skills had saved their lives. Dr. Morrison assisted with passenger medical needs while Colonel Thompson continued coordinating with crew members to ensure everyone remained calm during the approach. Flight attendant Santos worked with other crew members to document the incident and prepare for the extensive debriefings that would follow. The professionalism of everyone involved helped maintain order during what could easily have become chaotic. First Officer Park handled communications with ground authorities, her military background enabling her to provide tactical summaries that helped officials understand the scope of what had occurred. Captain Hayes focused on the aircraft systems and landing procedures, though he continued glancing at Sarah with expressions that mixed gratitude, confusion, and professional curiosity. The landing itself was flawless, but it marked the beginning of complications that would extend far beyond the aircraft. As soon as they touched down, the Boeing 777 was surrounded by military and law enforcement personnel from multiple agencies. Passengers were evacuated through carefully controlled procedures that allowed investigators to document the scene while ensuring everyone received appropriate medical and psychological support. Sarah found herself separated from passengers and crew for immediate debriefing by officials whose credentials identified them as representatives of intelligence agencies from both the United States and United Kingdom. The questions began before she had even left the aircraft. How had a decorated special operations pilot ended up working as a flight attendant? What classified information might have been compromised by her exposure? How many other military personnel were operating under civilian cover? The debriefing sessions continued for hours in secure facilities at Heathrow Airport. Sarah provided detailed accounts of the hijacking, her tactical decisions, and the coordination with other passengers who had assisted in neutralizing the threats. But the questions went far beyond the immediate incident. exploring her military service record, classified operations, and the circumstances that had led to her civilian career. Intelligence officials were particularly concerned about operational security implications. Sarah's background included participation in missions that remained classified, involving personnel and operations that could be compromised if her military identity became public knowledge. The media attention surrounding the hijacking incident threatened to expose information that could endanger ongoing operations and other personnel. Meanwhile, the passengers were undergoing their own debriefings, providing statements that painted a remarkable picture of events. Family members and friends who met them at the airport heard accounts that seemed impossible. A flight attendant who had single-handedly taken down multiple armed terrorists using combat skills that suggested extensive military training. The college students who had been excited about their London adventure found themselves describing scenes that belonged in action movies. Business travelers who had been working on laptops during routine meal service provided testimony about witnessing highly coordinated tactical operations. Elderly passengers spoke of a grandfatherly figure who had somehow known exactly how to protect everyone during the crisis. Dr. Morrison's debriefing revealed additional details about Sarah's capabilities that impressed even experienced military personnel. His Special Forces background enabled him to provide technical assessments of her tactical decisions, coordination skills, and combat effectiveness that highlighted the sophistication of her training and experience. Colonel Thompson's account provided the most comprehensive analysis of the counter-operation, documenting tactical decisions and coordination that exceeded what most military units could achieve under similar circumstances. His professional assessment carried weight with officials who were trying to understand exactly what had occurred aboard the aircraft. The media attention began within hours of landing. News organizations had monitored emergency frequencies and witnessed the military escort during approach, recognizing that something extraordinary had occurred. Initial reports focused on a successful passenger resistance to hijacking, but details about the flight attendant, who had led the resistance, raised questions that attracted international attention. Sarah's personal life became the subject of intense scrutiny as journalists attempted to piece together her background. Her colleagues at Continental Airways provided interviews describing a professional, competent crew member who had never mentioned military service. Neighbors from her apartment complex described a quiet woman who kept to herself and seemed to live an unremarkable civilian life. But military aviation enthusiasts began connecting details from passenger accounts with publicly available information about special operations programs. Sarah's call sign Viper appeared in several accounts, and researchers with knowledge of military aviation recognized it as belonging to a classified program that had operated in highly sensitive areas. The intelligence agencies faced a complex challenge: how to protect classified information while acknowledging the heroic actions of someone whose cover had been completely blown in the most public way possible. Traditional approaches to managing operational security didn't account for situations where classified personnel saved hundreds of civilian lives using skills that revealed their true backgrounds. The solution involved a carefully orchestrated media strategy that acknowledged Sarah's actions while limiting details about her specific military background. Official statements praised the heroic actions of crew and passengers, while describing Sarah as a crew member with prior military experience, without specifying the nature or extent of that experience. But the passengers who had witnessed her transformation knew they had seen something extraordinary. Support groups formed among those who had been aboard the flight, creating communities of people bonded by shared experience of events that few others could understand or believe. Sarah faced personal decisions that were as complex as the intelligence agency concerns. Her civilian career was finished. No airline would employ someone whose actions had attracted international media attention and ongoing intelligence agency interest. Her carefully constructed quiet life was permanently shattered. The Air Force offered reinstatement with promotion and assignment to prestigious positions that would utilize her demonstrated capabilities. Intelligence agencies suggested roles in specialized programs that could benefit from her unique combination of skills and experience. Private security firms offered lucrative contracts that would apply her abilities to corporate and governmental clients. But Sarah found herself thinking about the faces of passengers who had looked to her for protection during the crisis. Children who had been terrified until they saw adults taking decisive action to ensure their safety. Elderly travelers who had trusted her guidance during the most dangerous moments of their lives. Young people whose excitement about their London adventure had been preserved because someone had been willing to use deadly skills to protect innocent lives. 6 months after the hijacking, Sarah Mitchell accepted a position with an international organization dedicated to aviation security and counter-terrorism operations. Her role involved developing training programs that would prepare commercial aviation personnel for crisis situations while maintaining operational security for classified military personnel transitioning to civilian careers. The work allowed her to use her skills in service of protecting innocent travelers while helping other military veterans navigate the challenges of maintaining civilian cover while remaining prepared to act if circumstances required. It was a compromise that acknowledged the reality of her situation while creating purpose from the unexpected end of her quiet civilian life. The hijackers who had planned to use Flight 447 as a weapon had failed completely in their intended mission, but they had succeeded in one unintended consequence. They had forced the emergence of capabilities that would make commercial aviation safer for millions of future travelers. Captain Sarah Mitchell, callsign Viper, never served coffee on a commercial flight again, but her actions on that flight over the Atlantic Ocean established new protocols, training programs, and security measures that protected countless other flights from similar threats. The quiet flight attendant was gone forever, but what replaced her was something more valuable. A guardian whose skills and experience were now dedicated to ensuring that innocent people could travel safely through dangerous skies, protected by those who understood that sometimes the most important battles are fought by those who never wanted to fight again. The hijackers had picked the wrong plane, threatened the wrong passengers, and underestimated the wrong crew member. Their failure became a testament to the dedication of those who serve in the shadows, ready to emerge when innocent lives hang in the balance, regardless of personal cost or professional consequences. In aviation security training facilities around the world, the events of Flight 447 became case studies in crisis management, tactical coordination, and the importance of recognizing that sometimes the most dangerous person on an aircraft is exactly the person innocent passengers need when their journey takes an unexpected turn toward danger at 39,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean.